Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online. Welcome. Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online. Welcome to CSIS.
Good morning to our American colleagues. Good afternoon to our European colleagues. My name is Heather Conley. I'm Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic region at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We are delighted that you could join us to talk about a topic that many of you know CSIS has spent an enormous time researching, and that is the Arctic and the High North. I hope this finds all of our viewers and listeners well during quarantine and the pandemic. And I also want to send a message, particularly to our American colleagues, that this has been an exceptionally difficult week for our country. And I want to send also that our thoughts and prayers are with the American people. So thank you so much for joining us today. So we have two exceptional individuals to help us think about the security dynamics in the High North and in the Arctic. First, let me introduce them, and then I'll introduce the topic a little bit, and then we look forward to having a great conversation. Please know that we welcome your questions as you view our conversation. Please put them in, and then we will try to incorporate them into the conversation. So please use that function on Zoom, and we look forward to adding them into the conversation. Let me begin first by introducing State Secretary Tone Skogen, who is the State Secretary in the Norwegian Defense Ministry. Prior to that, State Secretary Skogen was also served in the Foreign Ministry and capacity as State Secretary. We are also delighted to have with us the Right Honourable Tobias Ellwood, who is the chairman of the UK's Defence Select Committee. And from 2017 to 2019, Mr. Ellwood served as Parliament Under Secretary of State in the UK Ministry of Defence. So we have two very well-placed policymakers and parliamentarians to have a look at this region. Before I begin any conversation on the Arctic, I always think it's important to just have a frame of reference and to show a map. And if my colleagues can just turn to two maps I want to show. Just the first one, again, to orient us, is the Arctic region itself and understanding the vast size both of the Russian coastline, 51%, but as well the vast expanse in the North American Arctic as well. To the next slide, we're going to be talking a bit about this area in particular, which is known as the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, Norway Gap, the GIUK Gap. And we'll be talking about that a little bit, and I just wanted to give you a quick map and a frame of reference. All right, we have our introductions out of the way. We have our mental maps on. I think we're ready now for our conversation. I always like to begin with the news. And in the news, we just had a recent announcement by the commander of the Russian Northern Fleet that we anticipate some significant Russian military exercises, perhaps at the end of June. This is the third year in a row where we've seen a pretty significant Russian exercise in the Barents Straits and the Norwegian Sea. So if I may first turn to you, Tone, could you help us understand what you're seeing in these exercises? What concerns you about Russia's growing military capabilities in the High North?
Well, thank you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to at least, if not explain, but try to share some thoughts with you on that particular issue. I think it's fair to say that we do see Russian exercises not only coming up the end of this month potentially, but actually more frequent. We have been seeing now for quite some time. So there seems to be more or less a new pattern in the way we can read the Russian exercises. And of course, as a close neighbor to Russia in the north, Norway is witnessing an increasingly potent Russian military capability. And what we see is Russia continuously strengthening its ability to threaten sea lines of communication, engage long-range targets, and disrupt reinforcements to the entire European continent. And also we see recent Russian submarine activities and long-range aviation patrols south of Iceland verify and demonstrate Russian capabilities. What we also know, of course, is that Russia is acquiring new classes of conventional and nuclear attack submarines, continues its modernization of the Northern Fleet. We see an increased challenge in Russian long-range precision-guided missiles. But, to make the picture, I guess, balanced and to have the full picture, we also need to take into account the overall state of the Northern Fleet, in which many units are indeed outdated and poorly maintained. Talking about, the Russian exercises, of course, what we did see also last fall, when we had the big Russian exercise, we also saw how Russia is increasingly coming closer to our coasts, how they are increasingly getting farther south, and also how they have now been able to more or less successfully demonstrate that in order, I believe, to protect their own bastion, the whole missile defense system on the Kola Peninsula, actually the whole Scandinavian peninsula could find itself more or less locked up or closed in as part of some of the exercises we see and the results of that. So I guess hopefully this is what I could offer at this point. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. And Tobias, I'd welcome the view from London and the understanding of this being the Russian both long-range bombers, submarine activities coming closer and a more southern direction has got to be of great concern to the United Kingdom.
Well, firstly, Heather, can I begin by saying thank you for inviting me here today. And it's a pleasure to be joining my NATO counterpart on this discussion. And I'm really pleased that you are focusing on this neck of the woods. If you think about the bits of real estate across the world that get focused on, where there are tensions and so forth, and developments, this perhaps is one corner of the woods that does get left behind. But as you touch on, activity is growing. And that's, I think, for a number of reasons, partly also because of the ice pack is retreating. It's going to become a major international thoroughfare. It's also Russia's backyard. And I think they want to absolutely protect it. As that ice pack moves, they don't want other international interest to come into that space. So I think part of what we're seeing, just add on to the State Secretary's important opening comments there, is Russia actually saying, this is my corner, this is my backyard, you guys stay away. And but it's always been important to them, the Barents Sea, the Kola Peninsula. It's where 2/3 of Russia's naval forces are based. We touched on the advancement in their own submarine capabilities as well. But it's also about flexing their muscles. And yes, my constituency, my district is on the very south coast of the UK. We've seen these Bear aircraft do a full circle around Ireland and the UK, show some presence, and then fly all the way back there. So this is all a statement of intent to say that we are growing and growing, don't mess with us.
Absolutely. And I think that show of force and the frequency of exercise continues to demonstrate that Russia certainly is signaling to NATO, to its neighbors, how vital the Arctic is. If I can turn to talk about some very concerning and sophisticated new weapons, I take your point, Tone, that Obviously, Russia's military modernization, while in some areas quite extensive, others it may not be quite as robust. But in the new equipment category, we're starting to see, particularly in their submarine capabilities. Unfortunately, we learned of this through a tragedy of a very deep submersible that was lost, and 14 Russian crew members were lost tragically. President Putin is talking about an underwater nuclear drone, the Poseidon. So we're seeing some new developments here. And I, again, would welcome your reflections. What do you make of this? Is this show? Is this really something that can deeply impact security in the North Atlantic?
There we go. Well, I think this is definitely more than a show. At least what we do see is Russia strengthening its military capabilities, not only in terms of the submarines, which you mentioned, but on a more general term. And I guess what we also see is that the North Atlantic remains one of the most important patrol areas for the Russian submarines. And I don't think we will see any changes in terms of that slowing down in the time to come. I did mention the exercise we saw last fall, the Ocean Shield, as it was called, which was, of course, the largest Russian exercise since the Cold War. So again, also to pick up on my UK colleagues' comment, I mean, I think they sort of mean to tell you a story that we are indeed here and they intend to stay here. We, of course, would focus on the need to be predictable, to try to be transparent. So we have aimed at also having an sort of information line, trying to be what we called a predictable neighbor, being open and transparent in terms of our exercises, in terms of what we do. We don't necessarily see the same from the Russian side, but in a situation where we do see the Russians stepping up, both in terms of their capabilities, but also in terms of showing that in terms of exercises, getting, as I said, closer and closer and more frequent. We need to balance this by also making sure that the way we respond to this does indeed have sort of a deterring effect. Thank you.
Well, and thank you. Absolutely. Transparency is critical. Notification is critical, so there's not misunderstanding. Tobias, I'm wondering, it's not just the Russians that are exercising in this area. Certainly NATO with Trident Juncture in 2018. Of course, Defender 2020, which was really in some ways to test not only those important sea lanes as U.S. forces move across the Atlantic and then across Europe, was unfortunately curtailed because of COVID-19. So I'm wondering if you could give us your sense of the critical nature of those sea lanes. And of course, some analysts believe that a lot of the Russian activity is related to undersea cables, which are vitally important to transit important data, that some believe that could be in part why we're seeing so much of this particularly experimental submarine activity.
Well, these are such important points that you raised, and I think it's a reflection of the geopolitical challenges that we face. The international architecture is no longer strong enough to actually punish countries for yielding military power. Probably the best example of that is the South China Sea, with what China is doing there, taking over a massive footprint of sea, and nobody really able to challenge or get in the way there. We're doing our best, but there isn't that collective attitude. So is Russia taking a leaf out of that book and saying we need to do the same in the north, in the Arctic, bearing in mind, as I mentioned, the ice is retreating, the space is becoming available. We'd better make sure that we own this. I mean, there were some jokes at the start of, remember those scenes with Russia putting flags in the sea, saying this is our territory. Well, actually, that was highly symbolic. and what's been touched on here as well, and you raise it with the Poseidon systems there, the character of conflict is changing as well. We're unlikely to get direct, I think, confrontation, intervention in the conventional sense. It's going to be more subtle. It's going to be hybrid warfare. It's going to be interfering with our way of life. What easier way to do it than snip some of those important cables to economically hit us? And that's where you see a change in attitude with Russia in what systems it's actually procuring. Let's look at the Russian budget. This defense budget isn't huge. What they're good at, and arguably better at than perhaps us, is their ability to research what they need to have, what is required coming over the hill. And what they've done is look back, take stock at the fact that Putin wants to put more money into defense, or limited amount of money. Let's make sure it's actually effective. And what we're seeing is them shift to a maritime capability. I think that they have 6 different classes of submarine. In the UK, I think we have 2. In the United States, I think it's only a couple as well. So they are really advancing their capabilities. Much of it is beneath the threshold of what we would consider conventional war.
Now, those are very, very important points. I want to bring a question in from our audience. Actually, we've seen recently 2 new strategies coming out of Russia. One in March was their new Arctic strategy, and then, of course, the other day, their nuclear deterrence strategy. And just, Tone, just to throw to you, if you have any thoughts as your ministry has, I'm sure, studied this new Arctic strategy. What is it telling you? And if you have any thoughts or any reflections, if you'd like to, on Russia's new nuclear deterrence strategy. Obviously, we're analyzing that here as well, and it comes against the framework of an arms control architecture that is rapidly deconstructing. So I'll turn that over to Tone. I think you're still muted.
Yes. I don't know, is it okay now?
Nope.
Okay,
there you go.
Well, as you said, the strategies you referred to are quite recent. So I think it's a little early to actually have a very sort of a firm elaboration on the take on that. I think we will need a little more time before we are ready to do that. But let me just also offer that we have at least been trying to have dialogues with the Russians. Part of what I refer to transparency, openness, being keen to keep the information lines open. So we would aim at trying to also have some sort of a dialogue and to learn more about also these issues on a more bilateral basis.
Dialogue is absolutely essential, and I fear that we are mis-signaling to one another. A big signal that the United States and the United Kingdom just sent very recently was doing a freedom of navigation operation in the Barents Sea, the first in 30 years. Tobias, what did that mean for the UK to do that? I know it certainly sent a very strong message that the US sent naval vessels there, but help us understand that importance in particular. I think Tobias may have, oh, there he is.
Sorry, usual fault with these gadgets here. You leave yourself on mute. I think it's a massive statement of intent by the United States and Britain, and indeed it's something I think NATO is pursuing as well, to make sure that we can patrol these seas and make it very clear these are international waters. They cannot be closed down in the way that we've seen, as I touched on, with the South China Sea. So it's a very clear indication and marker to say how we should go forward. The UN has a convention to protect these things, but who polices it? Who's able to actually stand up to this? And it's a reflection, I think, of where the character of war has actually gone. If we go back to the Soviet era of when they would perhaps have taken missiles to Cuba, there would have been a response. The Soviets would have been punished for their actions. I'm afraid the West has become a little bit timid in actually standing up for what we believe in, what we actually are willing to defend, what lines are we actually going to say should not be crossed. I'm afraid that they become a bit blurred. So you're then left with, not rather than punishing a country for doing something, because that's almost too late, we're not going to do that, and risk, an all-out war. What you have to do is go into denial. You have to deny your competitor the ability to take ownership of that space in the first place. And that means showing presence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were very concerned a year ago seeing that the Russian government had made some significant changes to the use of the Northern Sea route. Of course, we have a difference of opinion with both Russia and China about internal waters versus international passage. But in fact, the Russian government had now required a 45-day notification before military vessels can proceed through the Northern Sea route. Left unchallenged, or perhaps I did not see quite the level of public comment on that, you create a precedent where you allow fees to be collected, you allow this, and then the precedent's been set that in fact these waters are appearing more internal rather than international. In fact, Tony, Norway did not participate in that freedom of navigation operation. We got a question from our audience asking, was there a reason why Norway did not participate in that freedom of navigation operation? And then I want to add a second question onto that. I'd like to start looking at what allies are doing in response to some worrisome Russian trends. And I'd love to hear more from the both of you about UK-Norwegian bilateral defense cooperation, which has just been taking some pretty strong steps. So Tony, I'll turn that to you. Oops, that mute button is the bane of our existence. There you go.
Okay, well, let me take the first one. Well, as you said, Norway was, of course, invited to take part in parts of the operation, and the fact that we didn't was for the very good and basic reason that we didn't at that time have any capabilities available, because we were already engaged with the relevant frigate that was in question in France or elsewhere. So actually we had to decline, but that doesn't mean that we did not really approve or favor the whole operation as such. But there was actually just a practical reason, a capacity reason why we could not participate. As goes for the UK-Norwegian relationship, I mean, that goes way back, and as you said, is also now in a very good phase of progressing even more so. We do, of course, not only share geography, oceans, concerns, being members of the same alliance and what have you, but we are now also increasingly working together, for instance, on the P8s and how we can both benefit from that, not only in terms of the airplane itself, but in terms of how we could work together, how we could help each other with spare parts, with education, with training, with all the practical issues relating to that. And we also have recently entered into a couple of MOUs that will even further strengthen the bilateral cooperation. So, things do have a very good history in that respect, and we will continue to work very closely, both with our UK, but also, of course, with US and other allies.
Tobias, in fact, I would say the UK, going back to 2012, was a leader when Liam Fox was Defense Secretary, thinking about the Northern Group, thinking about greater UK leadership within the Northern Europe security and defense community. Help me understand from the UK perspective how these bilateral ties, already very strong, what does that mean? And are you doing it at the parliamentary level as well?
Yes, and I can only echo the State Secretary's comments then. There is a very strong relationship between our two nations, and rightly or wrongly, we both have a different relationship with the European Union. We're slightly outside that particular club, but when it comes to European security,
growing these bilateral ties, already very strong.
Together. The
What
P8
does
was
that
mentioned,
mean? And
well
are you doing it
overdue
at the
for us to have
parliamentary
that
level as
maritime
well?
air capability.
Yes, and I can only echo
coming in
the
as well,
State Secretary's
giving us a much more greater response. Without breaching any of the operational details that I get to see, I can say that the submarine activity by Russia in the Northern Sea off our coast between us and Norway has hugely increased over the last numbers of years. It's getting very, very busy indeed. And it will require not just Norway and the United Kingdom, but other nations as well, to recognize that if we are going to be able to patrol our seas, keep them open, that we need to focus on this. Like I said at the very, very beginning, this is a corner of the globe that is going to become ever busier. And it's so important that we set the parameters, the precedents we set now, rather than allowing, as you said, Russia to dictate the rules. This, I'm afraid, is where the world has gone to. And China has actually leveraged this to its effect, sets up new rules, new parameters. They don't really get checked. And then that becomes the new normal. And we must make sure that doesn't happen in the Arctic.
Absolutely. What I'd love Tony, to turn to you. I mean, the U.S. has also, I like to say, rediscovered its Arctic ambitions a bit. And it was a major step to reconstitute the Second Fleet, to really return to the North Atlantic. Now, gosh, it's been a year and a half since that fleet was restored. There's a lot of Norwegian impact and guidance in that command structure. I'd like you both actually to reflect on U.S. engagement in securing the North Atlantic, but also, again, part of the maritime patrol aircraft, enhancing the hangar space at Keflavik, engaging this more meaningfully. Help us, give us the perspective of how you see Washington engaging in this issue. Oh, and that mute button, there you go.
I'm getting it now, okay? Well, we very much welcome the fact that the US has been, I dare say, sort of stepping up its presence, its interest, and activities in our areas. To us, of course, that is of utmost importance, but I believe it's also a confirmation of the strategic importance of this part of the world. And that also, of course, that is being recognized by not only by us people, but also by the US. So we very much welcome both the establishment of the JFC Norfolk and also the Second Fleet, very much in line with Norway's long-standing position and increased focus on the maritime. And we have also been very pleased to see, this being reflected, which this is a consequence of within the NATO setting. So all in all, just a short answer. It's very positive and it's welcome, and we look forward to continue working together closely with both the US but also UK in the same respect.
I'll ask the same question. How do you view the U.S. in understanding NATO, the strategic implications of the North Atlantic, the High North, the Arctic?
We're really reassured that the Americans are taking a huge interest here. The last few years has seen a psychological pivot, to the Asia, and that's concerned many Europeans. Where does that leave America's commitments, to this important alliance? That's worked so well since the Second World War, even questioning, Donald Trump questioning the funding and so forth. Understandably, we want other nations to upgrade their spending, but ultimately we've seen that commitment, that longer-term commitment, being underlined, and I think that's manifests itself in the Second Fleet itself. But also, as I say, a reflection of the changing character of war. Let's not forget that security and the economy are inherently linked, and 90% of our trade is done by sea. That comes to the UK. Keeping those shipping lanes open, keeping them free, keeping them from a cost perspective, open in that. It requires us all to uphold those international laws. So I'm really pleased that the United States is absolutely engaging on a practical level.
Well, again, I'm going to have you both put those parliamentarian hats on. Strategies are great. Budgets are essential. So, Tone, I know the Norwegian government is working on their long-range defense plans. How much do all of these developments, Russia's military modernization, its reinvigoration in the high north, and getting political support to continue to fund a military that's modern. And of course, as Tobias mentioned, there has been enormous pressure by the Trump administration to get our European allies to 2% of defense spending for GDP. So how is the long-range defense plan working, its element and engagement? And then Tobias, I'm going to turn to you and ask you for some early reflections before the government starts the integrated review. So Tone, please. You're still muted.
There it goes. It's not very cooperative, but here we go. Well, in terms of the 2%, of course, the situation we are all presently facing with the virus, with the corona, could, and we hope not, but that could, of course, mean that we will meet the 2% target sooner than later. We hope that will not be the case, but I think to us, that is also an indication of, I should probably be careful to say how little useful it is, but I mean, a percentage doesn't really give you a very good indication of the real defense capability. So, the present situation is a good illustration of that. Back to your initial question, yes, we have been for quite some time working on our next 4-year long-term plan. Actually, what we did prepare and present to Parliament was an 8-year plan, indicating that within the defense sector, both decisions, implementation, what have you, really needs to have a long-term perspective. We presented our plan to Parliament in the second half of April. Parliament just made a decision earlier this week, asking the government quite a few issues that they would like to see more information on. I think this is a token not only of the fact that we have a minority government, meaning Parliament can, sort of do things like that, but I like to say on the positive note that this is also a confirmation that the interest for defense budgets, for everything that defense represents, has become much higher on the agenda in recent times. Again, I think the Russian situation and the increased activity from Russia, in addition, of course, to a more overall severe security situation on a more global basis, has this effect. So to get support for increased defense spending is not necessarily a problem, quite the contrary. It seems to me that many of the parties are now more or less trying to compete who can be sort of the most defense-friendly party. We, of course, would argue that the plans you present and the plans that end up being adopted need to be well balanced in every respect. And we also do want to make sure that it's not only the ambitions you decide upon, but you also need to make sure that there is finances to go along with it. Otherwise, you will end up with a fairly unrealistic plan, and that's the least we need in these times. So going forward, we will now go somewhat more into details on some of the issues that Parliament has requested to get more information on, and then get back to Parliament. But I believe this means we probably will not have the next plan endorsed till sometime in the fall.
Yes, I mean, I know obviously every country's budget picture changed dramatically 2 months ago with COVID-19. And I think, Tobias, the UK has obviously an additional challenge, both of the economic implications of COVID-19, potentially Brexit, unclear how things will resolve themselves. at the end of this year. And I'm haunted by the 2010 Strategic Defense Review, which eliminated those MPAs and really was a devastating cuts that had to be brought back. What is your anticipation for the integrated review? Do you think the Arctic and these set of issues we've talked about will receive important attention? Parliament has been great. I know I testified before select committees that were very focused on the Arctic. So parliamentarians get this. The government's going to have some hard decisions, are they not?
You're absolutely right. And we have delayed that integrated review, that important study, which firstly asks the question as to what is Britain's place in the world? What role do we see ourselves playing? What are our aspirations to help actually be a force for good and working with our allies like Norwegians or the United States and so on to help shape the world as it changes very, very rapidly in front of us? And there's some big questions there because, as I alluded to in previous questions, there is a frailty of international world order, and which is giving the space, if you like, for bad things to happen, for adversaries, competitors to exploit. I fear that when the fog of COVID-19 lifts, we will actually find a very insecure and dangerous world that we face. Now, the question that we have, going back to Parliament itself, is the fact that we don't perhaps spell out to the British people exactly how bad things actually are. We have a tendency to say, yes, throw anything at Britain and we can manage. And actually that isn't the case. Our armed forces are overstretched as they are now. I'd arguably say they're some of the best and most professionally trained in the world. But ultimately our battle tank is over 20 years old. Our fast jets, we have in the Gulf War, we had 36 squadrons. We're down to 6 today. 2 new great aircraft carriers, but the naval budget didn't change. So it's impacted on the rest of the surface fleet. And now we're talking about, the changing nature of warfare, moving up into space. The weaponization of space is happening. Cyber security as well is something that we're not spending enough money on. Some big decisions, therefore, for government to make at the very time when we've got this massive recession, the global recession, about to hit us and knock us down.
Indeed, I think this is a challenge for all governments. We've certainly been seeing the view of the Arctic through that great power competition lens, through the national security strategy. And I'm going to use the remaining few minutes that we have left to talk about China in the Arctic. Certainly, the Trump administration has been quite focused and very concerned about Chinese infrastructure activity in the Kingdom of Denmark, in Greenland. We've just completed a major study that tries to think through scenarios what great power competition would look like in the Arctic to 2050. There's a lot of hype about China's activities in the Arctic. We have to pull through that. But I'd love for both of you to share, beginning, Tony, with you, China's role in the Arctic. Norway was the canary in the mine in 2010 to receive wolf warrior diplomacy before I think it was given a name because of the bestowing of the Nobel Peace Prize. Your reflections on China's role in the Arctic, and then Tobias, I will turn to you for your reflection.
Oh, I did it. Okay, good. I think I did it. Yes. Well, of course, the fact that China is now showing increased ambition also for the Arctic introduces some new challenges. But I believe it's fair to say that although China's investment and engagement in the Arctic is growing, the Arctic is not a top priority for China. And also so far, we need to keep in mind that there is no Chinese military presence in the region. As we see it, basically the Chinese are focusing more on the commercial aspects of what the Arctic might hold as potential. But I mean, we need to make sure that we do have an awareness of this, and that we also do know how to handle the potential security and defense related consequences that such increased activity also from China might represent in the time ahead.
Absolutely. And Tobias, there is some profound changes occurring right now in UK policy towards China. And I don't know whether you've thought about, in more concrete terms, what a greater Chinese economic and potentially comes with it a military presence very close to the UK's shores.
Well, firstly, it's so important to factor China in, I think, working with Russia in what's happening in the Arctic Circle. They're now a member of the Arctic Council. I think they have permanent observer status. And what Russia does, I think it does absolutely in alliance with what China is up to as well. We cannot distinguish, much as you have, arguably two power competitors there from the American perspective. They should be treated as one alliance. And for many in Britain, the conduct of China through this COVID-19 has prompted many to actually recalibrate their view of the country itself. I mean, there was this desire. I remember George Osborne doing a visit as Chancellor to woo China, to get them to invest in Britain. But there was this genuine hope that as the economy grew, and they've done an incredible job of expanding as the way they've done, lifting people out of poverty, but they haven't embraced international order in the way that everybody hoped and become a responsible global citizen. They actually enjoy having perhaps the power of a superpower, but not wanting any of the unwritten responsibilities that go in upholding the international rules and laws that we abide by. In fact, they enjoy exploiting them for their own benefit. And I fear that there is going to be a clash of geopolitical ideologies. We're seeing countries become subservient, being swayed into their way of thinking because of their debt trap diplomacy through the One Belt, One Road, or through 5G commitments and so forth, and now even through the protective equipment that is.
I think we may have lost your signal, Tobias. You've just frozen for a moment. Let me. There you go.
For Chinese vortex choice between which being neutralized.
Absolutely. So let me, I'm going to end on more of a sober note. Part of the research that we've been doing in the Arctic is thinking about how Russia and China may work more actively together, militarily, economically, scientifically. Tone, is this something that your strategic planners are contemplating, or not really? Tobias, is this something that the UK is watching? How, as you mentioned, sort of Western rules and norms versus those who wish to rewrite those rules and norms? Any implications for a stronger Sino-Russian condominium in the Arctic, and what does that mean for Western interests?
Well, of course, this is something that we are following quite closely. But let's also keep in mind that both, the Arctic and the High North does fortunately have a history of sort of peaceful coexisting, coexistence, and we would like to keep it that way. So, I mean, that would be one main priority, of course. To us, I believe it's fair to say that we would still argue that we consider Russia sort of the biggest challenge, at least for the time being. As I said, that doesn't mean that we are not fully aware that the Chinese are also showing increased interest in the Arctic, but not in the same way, and maybe not for the same reasons, potentially, as the Russians. So although we are very much aware of the Chinese interest and activity, our main focus will still be the Russian situation.
Absolutely. Tobias, thoughts on Russia and China in the Arctic or High North?
Well, I firstly bow to the expertise of the State Secretary, who's far closer to this because this is really her backyard. I fear, though, that this is Russia's South China Sea. I fear that that's exactly what they want to do there. And we're absolutely right that traditionally this has been an area of environmental interest for scientific research and so on, but it's been pretty inaccessible. The change right now is because of climate change. That is the big effect that we're now having to embrace is the fact that it's becoming far more accessible. And that means accessible to more mineral exploitation and resources and so on. Let's not forget that about, I think, 3/4 of the oil and gas reserves for Russia are up in that neck of the woods. 20%, 25% of those actually go to China as well. So you can see this alliance developing, getting stronger and stronger. And like I say, I really worry that there is this split, this schism between the way that China and Russia will do international business versus the West. And that's some big fundamental questions for us to embrace and no doubt consider in another event such as this on another occasion.
Well, I think even the dramatic and accelerated transformation of the climate in the Arctic is also facilitated by man-made disasters. What we're seeing now in these horrible pictures coming from Norilsk, Russia, where 20,000 tons of diesel have now spilled in part due to permafrost thaw, these changes. We know environmental changes are there. One of the earliest LNG carriers was able to travel so much earlier from the Yamal Peninsula to Chinese port. We know these changes are happening. Let me thank you both again for a really splendid, rich conversation about not only the military challenges that we're seeing in the Arctic, how allies are responding to those challenges. Thank you so much for your service. Be safe, be well to both of you and to our audience. And thank you for joining us. Please stay tuned for additional research and programming that we will do as we stay focused on the high north and the Arctic. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening to our European colleagues and a great day to our American colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you.